What is...
Give me all that crap.
Is that a particular flavor or is it Gingerade?
Gingerade.
Okay. I've only had that once, but I don't know. I don't think I was in the right mood for it, so...
Happy gut, happy butt.
What are we talking about today?
I was thinking we could chat around about how to count macros. This is something that a lot of people are interested in, especially after they've made some changes to just clean up their diet, and they're like, oh, I'm starting to try to eat protein with every meal, and I have some carbs, and I'm just not really sure how many I'm getting or how many I should have. Today I just wanted to do a tutorial on how to go about counting macros without giving really any specific recommendations because everybody's individual. What your friend gets doesn't apply to you. What applies to you is especially not going to apply to somebody of the opposite sex or anything like that. So
this is just going to be kind of macros 101,
yeah.
Like how to count them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And we could get into like a few recommendations at the end of, if somebody tells you to eat 1,200 calories a day, run away. Where do you think would be a good place to start with this? Like, just if you were brand new and you've cleaned up your diet already a little bit, you're past the point of eating more vegetables and trying to have protein with each meal, like what would be your number one?
Well, what are the macros? So
good point.
Yeah,
there we go.
I guess that would be kind of the starting point for me is, if we're talking about macros, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm. Right on. So if you spent some time trying to clean up your diet just a little bit, you probably have an understanding of what food sources are carbohydrates, what are proteins, and what are fats. But let's kind of rehash that just as for educational purposes. So carbohydrates are things like starchy grains and starchy vegetables, things like potatoes, bread, quinoa, rice, corns. Corn is more of a carbohydrate source, it's not a vegetable.
So carbohydrates are more the ones that people talk about when they're talking about keto. Like a lot of people demonize carbohydrates in some diets.
In the realm of if you've ever tried a low carb diet, I'm sure you have an understanding of what carbs are because you've tried to stay away from them completely. And then also you've got a lot of the more processed carbohydrates like cakes and stuff like that, pastries and those things. So those are all the carbohydrates. Proteins are found in meat sources, pretty generally, mostly meats. There are proteins in plants, but they're not a complete protein source. Whereas there's 9 essential amino acids, and when you eat meat, you can get all 9 of those essential amino acids. Versus when you try to take protein from plant sources, you have to combine certain ones, but pretty generally,
gets a lot more complicated.
Yeah, that just gets a lot more complicated. That's why it's really difficult to be a vegetarian and also like a strength athlete or something. Like you have to get really specific with a lot of your goals. So protein's pretty generally going to come from meat sources or things like milk, anything that comes from an animal products. And fats are things that are pretty generally found in nuts, seeds, and animal fats that usually come along with meat and within like cheese and milk and things like that. So pretty generally think like avocado, olive oil, corn oil, just anything that's oil-based or liquid at room temperature, it's pretty generally going to be a fat, or if it's kind of solid and then it melts whenever it gets heated up, that's
solid
a
at room
fat.
temperature.
Yeah, solid. Well, also liquid, like olive oil and things like that.
Oh,
Stuff that is liquid at room temperature, and then something that when it's heated a little bit liquidates at a melting point. So that'll be your fats. Proteins and carbs come along with 4 calories per gram of protein or carb. Fats come along with 9 calories. Calories are just a unit of energy. So if you're having so many grams of protein, so many grams of carbs, so many grams of fats, all that combines to create your total calorie intake for the day.
So most people that focus on a macro counting type of diet, are they still paying attention to calories, or do they are?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know I've seen some people that just try to only focus on the macro
and
measurements.
You absolutely can do that. So you can totally do that. It's just you just have to understand that no matter what diet you do, calories is at the bottom line. So you can focus on just macros and not pay any attention to your calories, but by paying attention to your macros, you're adjusting your calorie intake. Yeah. What would be your next question after?
You started to touch on a good intro to the conversation by talking about how fats have a higher calorie per gram versus proteins. Obviously 10 grams of fats has more calories than 10 grams of protein, right? So that's something to be aware of.
Yeah.
And that's why you'll see those ratios the way they are. You'll want more protein in your diet than you would fat in your diet.
The jumping off point from there is probably, okay, I need to set a baseline of fats and protein. Fats for hormonal support, because our hormones rely a lot on the level of fat sorry, my dog's sneezing. Our hormones rely a lot on how much fat we have in our nutritional intake. So you need but you need a baseline level of fat intake to support hormonal processes. So to make sure that you're producing enough testosterone, estrogen, and all those hormones that go along to support that, and also to support your hunger hormones, leptin, ghrelin, and all those. And then protein, you want a baseline of, especially if you're weight training, you need a baseline to support your muscle building processes. And so pretty generally, that's going to be a minimum of 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight. So if I weigh 100 pounds, I need 80 grams of protein minimum.
So this would be our first kind of recommendation in the one-on-one conversation.
Yeah. So I would need 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight to support my muscle building processes. That's just kind of a broad, general, safe bet there at a minimum. And with fats, most females don't really need to dip below 50 grams of fat per day. If you're trying to diet, then you can dip a little bit below that, but you don't want to stay any lower than that for any sustained amount of time. And that's a pretty general recommendation across the board for most females to help keep your hormones running smoothly.
I guess to keep the conversation interesting, that's a good thing to touch on. I guess, how would we make that recommendation? So I guess how would we calculate that? You said 0.8 grams per body weight, right? So grab your calculator.
Okay.
So if I weigh 215, how would I figure this? 215 times 0.8.
Times 0.8. 215 times 0.8. So you would need at least 172 grams of protein.
Okay. So that kind of gives us the first specific recommendation, I guess, to talk about this.
Yes.
And then from there, it starts to get a little more real. We're not just talking completely abstract ideas, but now we've got a specific recommendation that we can kind of build on from there.
Yeah. So say I give Michael that recommendation. He's 215 pounds. I give him the recommendation to have 172 grams of protein per day. Well, protein is 4 calories per gram. So that 172 times 4, his protein intake would take up a total of 688 of his total daily calories.
Okay.
From there, let's just say you need to
fill things in.
You can just fill in the gaps from there, basically.
Okay.
So based on his body weight and whatever recommended total daily calorie intake he would have based on his goals, his activity level, and all that. This is why I'm not getting specific with calorie recommendations, because it's very nuanced. We can go over that some other time if you guys are interested. Shot in the dark, his total daily calorie intake was 2,800 a day. So of that 2,800, 688 of that are going to be from protein. He needs to have an absolute minimum, probably as a larger male, of 70 grams of fat a day just to support his hormones. So then that 70 times 9 would be 630, and then he's already got 688 from protein. So he's got a total of 1,318 calories from his protein and his fat so far. So then from there, he's got a total of 1,472 calories to play with. So almost 1,500 calories of, you can just fill in the gaps with whatever you want. Yeah. If you want to be keto, you can make all that. Tons of fat and more protein. If you want to be high carb and really support like a lot of physical activity, you could turn that into 368 grams of carbs, which is a realistic shot for a larger active male.
Yeah. Well, that's actually, I think this is good, because I think when people start thinking, or they transition from thinking about just tracking one thing, calories, I think some people tend to get a little nervous when they start talking about having to track 3 different things. But if you approach it like this and just start with one, and then the other two start to fall into place a lot more easily. And I know sometimes the more we talk about it, we can make it seem a little confusing, but it's not that bad. It's really not.
I take it for granted also that like I've been working with my macros for probably over 6, 7, 8 years now, and so like I have a solid understanding of this, and I studied it in school throughout nutrition courses, so I'm like it all makes sense to me, whereas other people, like, they're seeing the chalkboard with the numbers floating around and they're like, oh my god, I don't know what's going on. But it can be overwhelming. So to start, like we said, pick one and stick with it, and it always needs to protein needs to be your baseline, and if you're eating plenty of calories, your carbs and fats will probably fall into place. You need to focus on that one for maybe a couple weeks, and then you can start to throw in the fats, because that's the second important one. Even if you're not focused on your total daily calorie intake, like just focusing on getting enough protein will probably get you feeling fuller more often throughout the day, to where you won't overeat as easily. And I want to say along with that, protein and vegetables, like meet your minimums of protein and meet a minimum of 3 handfuls of vegetables each day, like 3 big handfuls of vegetables, and then you will be less likely to overeat on other things.
Protein gets talked about all the time. It's a big marketing term. People like to say that these are protein chips or protein pancakes or something, and then they charge you more for them. But that's kind of the reason why protein gets talked about so much, is because it is a good one to start focusing on. For all those reasons you just said, you can eat more of it with a lower calorie density, and
a lower like calorie cost.
There you go.
Because it's expensive for your body to turn protein into fat stores. So if you're eating a lot of protein, first of all, it's not stressful on your kidneys. It's a big misconception. Unless you have some sort of medical condition where you need to play it safe for your kidney's sake, it's not dangerous. It won't create any issues either. That being said, we need to put a caveat on the protein deal. If you're like a 300-pound individual, 0.8 grams per pound of body weight at 300 pounds is kind of ridiculous and hard to get. After you cross a certain threshold, probably like 240 pounds or so, then you don't need to necessarily worry about that 0.8 gram deal. It's calculated based on lean body mass. Like you want to have 1 gram per pound of lean body mass, and if you're 300 pounds, and unless you're like really jacked and like really muscular, it's very unlikely that you've got 250 pounds of lean mass on you. So you could step it back some. Maybe you just have 200 grams of protein per day instead of getting up around 250 or so, because then it can be difficult. Going back to that protein recommendation, get that down, get it filled in. You can add in the fats a couple weeks later once you get a solid tracking habit down on your protein, and then you can bring in carbs and start filling your gaps to create a total calorie goal after that.
Well, then how would you start actually measuring these things?
Protein sources have different amounts of protein per their weight. What happens a lot of times is they'll get this goal, says I need 30 grams of protein for this meal, and no matter whatever tracking service they're using, you can use like MyFitnessPal, My Macros Plus, whatever. It's usually MyFitnessPal is what people resort to. So they set their food scale to grams, and they're like, okay, 30 grams of protein. They put this on, they're like, whoa, that's 230 grams. Oh no. And so then they try to take away almost 3/4 of it to get down to where they need to be. And then they wind up with something like this. And they're like, oh, that's all I get to eat? What?
Okay, so you got to be careful. You need 30 grams of protein, not 30 grams of chicken.
Right.
So you've got to do that calculation. And I know this is where it sounds confusing, but I guess you could look up in MyFitnessPal how many ounces of chicken or how many grams of chicken, whatever it might be, for this number of
grams of
protein.
protein.
I'm trying not to make this sound confusing,
Okay.
but we got to be specific to understand we need 30 grams of protein, not 30 grams of chicken. Okay.
Right. And so this is what gets people into trouble usually with carbs and proteins. So the total weight or the total volume of something does not equal the amount of protein in that item. So if I have a 300 gram chicken breast, it does not mean 300 grams of protein.
Okay.
And so an actual 5 ounces of chicken breast is going to be closer to that 30 grams of protein needed.
Okay.
And that's where a tracking service comes in really handy, things like MyFitnessPal, because they just throw that in there for you.
Okay.
You also need to be careful with those things because they rely on user input. So sometimes
they're not perfect.
They're not perfect, but it's a good estimation usually. Now, if you like add in your Mexican dinner and it says 500 calories for this big, huge plate of food, you're like, I don't know about that, but it sounds good. It's probably incorrect. So there's things like that where you need to be careful. And like MyFitnessPal has the verified green check mark, which helps you make sure that what you're putting in there is usually pretty accurate.
Yeah. So, I mean, for the one-on-one conversation, we definitely got to give you the understanding that this is a learning process.
Yes.
You cannot expect this to be perfect right out of the gate. You got to start small, and it really pays off as you get comfortable with this and learn these techniques and calculations and things like that. But you got to start small. Don't go into this with a perfectionist idea, because you'll burn yourself out quick if you expect to be doing it perfectly all in the beginning.
Yeah, for sure. And so that takes us back to starting with protein. Like, just start with one macro, track it consistently for several days, and try to hit a minimum. And that minimum, like we said, 0.8 grams per pound of body weight. And then once you've got that protein in line, then you can bring in your fats. And then you can bring in your fats from there. And so try to get a minimum of 50 grams of fat per day as a female, probably 70 as a male. Just keep hitting those minimums there, and then you can bring in your carbs to get your total calorie goal. Some tips, some pro tips: get a food scale. Get a digital food scale so it's easier to keep track of these things. When you're weighing items, it always helps to put a, like if you're meal prepping your protein or anything, it helps to create a cooked amount of it, and then just either put your container on the, say this is my meal prep container, I'll put it on there, and then I'll put my 5 ounces of chicken in there, and it comes out to 6, so I cut some of it off and put it back in there until it gets to 5, and then get that one out of the way, and just keep doing that process. Or, you know, like, you can do it raw if you want. It's just gross and takes a long time. So
yeah, it's much easier to weigh it once you get it.
Yeah. Don't get into like the nitty gritty, the fine details of weight cooked versus raw until you get to your carbohydrates. When you've got a good understanding of everything, when you start throwing in those carbohydrates, then you can start worrying about cooked versus raw, because carbs can absorb a lot of water.
Well,
I know.
I feel like there's
it's
a lot.
Hard to keep it simple.
It really is. What do you think what are the things that do need to be in place before somebody gets to this point? What do they need to already understand before they can get started talking about or thinking about macros and actually doing that?
Well, I think what we're talking about right here is for people who already have an understanding of what protein is, what carbs are, what fats are, how to create a good balanced meal, but they just need to dial in those last little bits. So if all of this just sounds like a foreign language to you, you probably have other things you need to work on first. Okay? So if you're eating lasagna for dinner, and that's it, just lasagna. Like, you don't know, I don't know, it might have protein in it. I'm not sure if it has meat or what. Like, okay, now I need to think, what are the ingredients of this lasagna? Does it have meat in it? Okay, it does. Does it have cheese in it? Okay, it does. Does it have pasta of some sort, a carb source? Yes, it does. Okay, I'm not having any vegetables. The tomato sauce doesn't really count. There's not much there. So I'm gonna add vegetables with this meal because it's got a protein, carb, and a fat.
Yeah.
Like so. But really separating those things and getting an understanding of what they look like separately is the first step. Creating balanced meals and having them 3 times a day is a good goal. Looking at nutrition labels and understanding, like anytime you eat something, anytime you eat something, look at the nutrition label, see how many grams of protein, how many grams of carbs, how many grams of fat it has in it. Look at the total calorie content of it. Like, just start understanding those things, and then you can start working on dialing in your macros more specifically. This isn't something that happens overnight. It's not like it just all of a sudden clicks. Like, it's always a work in progress. You can't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to start counting my macros. This is kind of that intermediate level of nutrition.
Well, I just know that trying to simplify the things you eat can make this so much more complex, or make it so much more simple.
Yeah.
You know, if you can simplify your meals, just like we talked about, you know, you can see what's what.
Well, it's like a college course when you try to start counting macros, like especially if you try to create a recipe or something. Like that's getting way out there and difficult for somebody that's just starting out. And so there are steps to this that you have to take to be successful with it. If you just jump in and try to count your carbs, protein, and fat and hit a calorie goal all at one time, you're gonna get way in over your head and just be like, oh God, what do I do? It's gonna be very difficult.
I think the protein thing is the easiest one to start with, and I think you described it right. You know, start there, and then it's easier to fill in those other 2 blocks. So, yeah, that's the best way I can think of.
Yeah. Good talk.
Okay.
Let us know what you guys want to see next.